Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fall podcast. I'm once again joined by Logos, Keith Preston, and Florian. This is episode 117 of the Roundtable. We're returning to the Middle East again. The last time we covered this was shortly after the original instigation of the Hamas war with Israel on October the 7th last year. It was October the 14th last year, so it's a little over a year later. But a lot's happened since then. So now, let's step back first and frame this entire conflict before I dive into the details. Number one, we've talked about this before with previous episodes like open source jihad and irregular warfare, and the moral component of war is the most important. The kind of conflict that is being waged by Iran and the axis of resistance looks a lot like the irregular warfare we saw with like Lawrence of Arabia against the Turks, communist insurgents in China under Mao, Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. And these, of course, are not exactly analogs, but we see a real analog with the Mujahideen in the 80s against the Soviets. It's the same basic idea. The organization of jihadis and Mujahideen forces in the modern age are a lot like what you saw with communist insurgents decades earlier. Instead of organizing around the texts of the communism like Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao, they organize around the religious text, the Quran, and maybe the Hadith, and then commentaries by their leadership on those books. So they create this high level of political, in this case, religious, loyalty to a cause for the sake of waging a protracted conflict. Now, this is where we begin to see that there's an advantage against the Western firepower. The Israelis, much like the United States and Vietnam and Afghanistan, have overwhelming conventional forces. And a direct confrontation would be a failure, as we saw in the War for Israeli Independence, the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War. And so there's been a shift in how fighting Israel has taken place. We see the shift in a really big way from 1982 to 2000, where under pressure from Hezbollah, Israel withdraws from the southern half of Lebanon, that is south of the Litani River, which is now the northernmost limit for this escapade of Netanyahu about a month ago. Now, Hezbollah already won. They drove Israel out of Lebanon, and now Israel returned in 2006, but then left again. So you could say Hezbollah's already won twice. I'm not entirely sure what Israel hopes to achieve by a third invasion of Lebanon. But the point is, though, what we've seen now is a successful transition of regional opponents to Israel to this asymmetrical method of warfare based on sort of denying Israel conventional battles, seeking to weaken them internationally through diplomacy, and making them look bad by overreach, and then also by attacking them economically. That's the big premise. It's a shift away from the conventional Arab armies lining up at the border that we saw yesteryear, and now insurgents and non-state actors supported by a state, i.e. Iran, being able to threaten another regional state in a way that was inconceivable in the past. And the three main groups of proxy forces that are involved in this are Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, all of which are, of course, a part of Iran's axis of resistance. And this began, of course, last year, October the 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel, and they kidnapped 150 people. They basically showed that the defenses that Israel had erected were not what they appear to be. And this is, I think, really the first step for framing this entire conflict. So far, this entire conflict has been to unmask the illusion of invincibility of Israel. So from 47 till now, to 2023, they've had this vision of invincibility, even in light of the 2006 war, because, quote unquote, Israel never got caught with its pants down. Well, October of last year, it certainly did. And there are other, within the order chain of escalation, before you get to full-scale conventional war, full-scale invasion of Lebanon, full-scale war between Israel and Iran, there's levels at which you can sort of unmask further the facade of Israeli military defense. The next level was in April of this year, where Iran launched a major attack, I believe it was on Tel Aviv, with missiles and drones. Most of them were shot down, especially with the help of the U.S. and Britain. And there was advanced warning, I think up to a month in some cases, given to both U.S. and Israeli forces. So this wasn't a complete surprise. but it was Iran showing that it was showing solidarity with its allies. So it shows two things, that its allies were being supported and that it could target Israel. More importantly, on October the 1st of this year, they launched a series of select strikes into Israel, hitting some air bases where the F-35s were located, and also hitting and damaging part of Mossad's headquarters. That showed that the Iron Dome, and more generally the threefold tier air defense system of Israel, could be penetrated. Now, all of these are progressive levels of unmasking. Now, you might say they haven't done a lot of damage, physical damage. And a lot of the Western press is globbing onto that and saying that this is why the axis of resistance is losing. But I think that's just a mistake, right? Their goal is mental. They're here to demoralize the Israelis, politically isolate them, get the global community to turn against them. And the reason why I think the strikes of Iran didn't kill so many people like Israel's is they want to position themselves as the good guys on the world stage. Look, we don't go around indiscriminately bombing and killing hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people. We launch precision strikes with missiles at military targets, such as the headquarters of Mossad, the airfields. And in that regard, I think even though the damage was, quote, minimal, Iran achieved all of its objectives in that strike in October. Hezbollah has been rocketing northern Israel and leaving it uninhabited for the last year. And so Israel has decided to invade, sort of, though it hasn't really fully invaded, and it's still operating within the zone that it occupied from 82 to 2000, south of the Litani River. And also at the same time, the Houthis have really been, I think of all three of the members of the Axis of Resistance, the Houthis have really been the MVP. Not only have they been able to strike Israel from Yemen, they've effectively closed down the Suez Canal, turning the clock back to 1800 on global trade, where you have to go around Africa, the Cape of Good Hope now, in order to get to the Indo-Pacific region, which is going to impose huge costs on Western finance. I think we can view Iran's actions and its allies in a broader context with China and its broader strategy of isolating and putting pressure on the U.S. by waging diplomatic and economic warfare, which, again, I'm not surprised China's doing this. That's an extension of, their way of war going back to Sun Tzu in modern times, to Mao's conception of protracted war. Now, this protracted war is on the world stage and not waged by insurgents, but nonetheless, it's the same idea. And of course, recently the USS Abraham Lincoln was relocated to the Indo-Pacific, leaving for the first time in, the last year, the United States. There was no U.S. carrier in the Middle East. So this is a huge win for the Houthis. Now, one can sort of speculate why the carrier was relocated into the Pacific. Maybe China's gearing up for something, or the U.S. is gearing up for something that we're not really aware of yet. We won't know until it happens because nobody's going to tell us. So this is just, reading the tea leaves, if you will. So, yes, Israel's killed a lot of combatants. They did a lot of strategic strikes early on to, quote-unquote, cripple and behead Hezbollah. Who knows if that'll really work? I'm sure they saw something like that coming. And given how the Taliban bounced back after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, I think Hezbollah could bounce back as well. Israel is increasingly isolated on the world stage, as well as the fact that within the last 2 months, there's been news articles saying that Israel's wanted more missiles from the United States to defend against Iran. And the U.S. is saying, well, we don't have enough for you and Ukraine and ourselves. This is the first time since World War I that the United States hasn't had enough munitions for all of its allies and itself. This is actually a huge earth-shattering revelation, even if they want to play it down. Nobody would have ever complained to the U.S. about that from World War I until now. So the cracks are showing in the armor, cracks are showing in the narrative. And I think everything we've seen since then has been an attempt to widen those cracks for the whole world to see, because a direct move on Israel can't really take place until it's more isolated. And then I think the last important thing to point out is after the attack on Israel on October the 1st, there was a drone attack on Netanyahu's private residence near Caesarea. He wasn't killed. Again, Western media argues that that's just incompetence of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has Al Jazeera reported on this that Hezbollah owned up to the attack. But I think this is more like the horse head and the bed scene from the Godfather, where it's like, we know where you live, we know what we can do to you. You might want to step off, because again, their goal is not mass collateral damage. Israel's is. That's why they don't care about where they bomb or strike. So I think what we see here is a level of restraint, probably imposed from Iran. Absent Iran's pressure, we can question would they be as restrained. Maybe, maybe not. And also the fact that the U.S. hasn't retaliated. I mean, the idea that a U.S. ally has been directly attacked twice, April and October. I mentioned that on Twitter, and one of the guests on the show, Rain, commented on Twitter saying this probably means China's tying up U.S. forces. Well, in light of the withdrawal of the USS Abraham Lincoln, that's even more evidence in his favor. So that's a bit of a mouthful right now. We'll toss it off to you, Logos. What do you think about the last year in the Middle East and what portends in the future?
Well, you seem to have the geopolitics mostly sorted out. Don't know what I can add to that. So I guess I'll talk about the economy a little bit. The big news to me over the last year is China's long game. They've been very, very smart about actively developing other economies in the world. In Africa, South America, BRICS, basically. They build roads, they build factories, they build infrastructure. I mean, it's loans. But really, I think China's been being fairly lax with its loans because the long-term investment isn't necessarily the lending money for these countries' infrastructure. What it is making these countries economic partners so they can, develop their economy, become consumers. And I heard a report recently that said China is selling 1.5 times more goods to developed BRICS countries than they are to all Western countries combined at this point. That's the long game. The long game is even if the West starts saying, wow, China bad, we're going to start boycotting them, tariffing them, whatever, China's setting itself up to go, well, we've cultivated our own demand base. We don't need you anymore. Fine, bye. And that's basically what they're doing. They've been doing it very, very well. The threat against the dollar, basically, the BRICS people are thinking about making a new currency to trade oil and other things. You've got a lot of financial pressures that are more than just military pressures that are impacting our ability for domestic policy. Trump wants tariffs and all that stuff. That I think is going to be the big thing. Not only are we militarily seeing our hands tied, we're about to economically see our hands tied as well. And I've been talking to conservatives about this, like inflation's inflation and Biden's America. It's like, well, you realize that Africa has industrialized at a rapid rate. They're now demanding global goods and services, and it's not necessarily the case that we have supplied the stuff they're demanding to match the demand of a whole new continent. So what happens when you have a whole new continent demanding goods and supply hasn't really been able to ratchet up, whether it's beans or metal or whatever, right? Prices go up. And this always bugs you when conservatives talk about inflation, because what they mean, generally speaking, inflation is just like general rises in prices that are permanent due to changes in like a money supply or something. But now people are using it for this generic, like prices go up, therefore it's inflation. It's like, well, hold on, are prices going up temporarily? Are they going up permanently? Is it an equilibrium problem, right? Is it a supply and demand shift, right? I would never go to an Econ 101 class and talk about like a supply curve shifting left and making stuff more expensive and be like, C class, that's inflation. It's like, no, that'd just be like a really odd use of terms. Supply has been constricted. Goods are harder to make. Goods are harder to buy. There's a mechanistic issue that we can talk about describing what's going on in the market. And people have just like lost their minds, and everything is down inflation when line go up. And it's just the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But it's a real global problem. Well, from our perspective, I mean, for everybody else in the globe, they're probably thinking it's pretty great. So yeah, I don't know what more else to add other than that, except it's the economic way I'm seeing it.
Sure. Before I give this to you, Keith, I want to briefly mention some stuff that Cyber Ninja Zero said to add context to what I was saying. He's in the chat. He said technically each of Iran's strikes was in response to an attack on Iran. The first strike followed Israel's hitting Iran's embassy in Syria. That would have been in April. And the second one was the assassination of Haniana in Iran. Yeah, okay. So that's right. Iran was couching these in terms of responding to attacks by Israel already, which is probably also why it was fitted within this ordered progression of escalation. But on to you, Keith.
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that first has to be understood about the October 7th incident is Israel's reaction was to use that as a pretext for what to do what a lot of the hardline Zionists and the Israeli government had long wanted to do, which is pursue a program of expansion and ethnic cleansing. I've been following the Zionist press for probably decades, and there's long been this talk about how they want to eh, purge the West Bank or purge Gaza of the Palestinian by forcibly relocating them somewhere else to to Jordan or Syria or Egypt or someplace like that. So and the current government of Israel, the Netanyahu government, is a coalition of right wing to extreme right wing parties. One thing that a lot of Americans don't realize is that Israel has the same culture war that we do between the left and right, or between modernist and traditionalist, or whatever you want to call it. Only it's far more intense. In fact, prior to October 7th, there were people that were worried Israel was going to implode into a civil war. Because keep in mind, Israel is a country the size of New Jersey, and yet their cultural polarization includes everything from, say, in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv could be Portland or San Francisco or L.A. They have pride marches and all of that. And then you've also got other Jewish populations, particularly the Mizrahim, which are like Middle Eastern Jews, as opposed to Ashkenazis, which are European Jews. A lot of those are as conservative as ISIS and Al Qaeda or the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. So this is a kind of polarization and cultural extremes that you can find in Israel proper. Right, that's just in Israel proper. Um, so there were concerns that there was going to be a civil war in Israel, and Netanyahu is considered center right within the context of Israeli politics. But what he has done is perpetually reach out to the most extreme sectors of the right in order to strengthen his own coalition. It's similar to what happened in Weimar, where the centrist parties could never, in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the interwar period, the centrist parties always had trouble holding. So they would reach out constantly to the extremes to try to build their own coalitions. And that had the effect of bolstering the extremes to the point that eventually the Nazi Party and the Communist Party became the two largest parties in Weimar. Um, then the So Netanyahu has done something similar. He's reached out to these extreme right wing parties. Like there's one party called the Party of Religious Zionism that is part of his coalition. And he's got these people like Itamar Ben Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich in his um, coalition. In the Western press, I see a lot of people downplaying the influence of these guys. They say, well, they're just fringe figures, they're just token figures. No, they're not. Smotrich is the finance minister. That's the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States. That's like Janet Yellen or somebody like that. All right. Smotrich is the minister. Ben Gvir, Odemar Ben Gvir, is the Minister of National Security. That's like the Director of Homeland Security in the United States. So these are very important high-level cabinet positions that these guys, who are basically like a Jewish version of Al Qaeda, actually hold in the Netanyahu government. Um, the So this is who's running the Netanyahu government. Now, what they've done with October 7th is that they've used that as a pretext to do what they always wanted to do, which was ethnically cleanse the West Bank, the West Bank and Gaza. They want to they want to ethnically cleanse Gaza, and either by killing the Palestinians altogether, or herding them into Egypt, or relocating them to Europe, or I've heard them talk about deporting the Palestinians to the United States. Um, that's one of their objectives, and that's why the bombing campaigns have been so intense. They're literally trying to force all of the Palestinians out of Gaza, either by killing them or just through displacement. And now they've also started upgrading their attacks on the Palestinians in the West Bank as well. The goal is to fully annex the West Bank, and there have been attacks not only on Palestinians but also on the ethnic Christian Armenians in the West Bank as well as non-Zionist Jews. I mean, not all Jews are Zionist, and in Israel you have Jewish populations that predate Zionism. And some of those see Zionism as blasphemy. They see the Israeli government as heretics or something like that. And a lot of these people are very, very fundamentalist type Jews, but they're anti-Zionist Jews. There have been attacks on these people as well. You can find videos online of the Israeli police attacking these guys that look like Hasidics or something like that. So that's what October 7th is being used for, is this kind of ethnic cleansing program for the purpose of totally annexing the West Bank and Gaza, and also expanding Israel's territorial domination into surrounding areas like South Lebanon, Syria. If you understand the ideology of hardline Zionism, I mean, there's different degrees of Zionism. There are liberal Zionists there and all of that. But the hardline Zionists believe that all of the territory that is described in the Tanakh, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, as the Promised Land, which is basically between the Nile and Euphrates, they think all of that rightfully belongs to Jews. And they have this idea of building a greater Israel where they eventually annex all of that territory. In fact, Bezalel Smotrich, who, like I said, he's the finance minister, he's the equivalent of the Secretary of the Treasury. Bezalel Smotrich was at a Zionist gathering in Paris earlier this year, and he held up a map showing exactly the territory that Israel wants to conquer, which is what I just described. Is basically the what they think is the ancient Hebrew Promised Land. There's another prominent writer this is a cultural figure, not a government figure, but there's a prominent Israeli writer gave an interview earlier this year where he was talking about this. He was saying they want to keep expanding on into Iraq until they meet the Kurds, because they're tactically allied with the Kurds. So they're like, well, we just want to eliminate everybody until, surrounding us, until we control all of these territories, and then we're not faced with enemies from external places and surrounded only by friends or by satraps and puppet states. And so this is the real ambition of the current sitting Israeli government. This is what they're trying to do. So the idea, well, we're just defending ourselves against terrorists or whatever, that's just a pretext. The October 7th attack really happened. People really got killed in it. There's evidence that some of them were killed by friendly fire under a military policy called the Hannibal Directive. That's a different story. But people were really killed. So the terrorist attack happened. But it's that Israel's response has to use it for a pretext for this kind of expansionist program. Now, in response to that, you have this Axis of Resistance alliance that Todd was talking about, and that includes both an alliance of states and non-state actors. It includes Iran, as well as the current Iraqi government, as well as Syria. And then it also includes Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. It includes some other groups scattered out throughout that region. And it's also actually something that is multi-confessional. Like the Axis of Resistance includes, even though it's led by Iran, who are conservative Shia Muslims, it also includes some Sunni, like the Hamas is predominantly Sunni. Hezbollah now is actually a multi-confessional organization. It used to be a Shia fundamentalist group, but now it's a mixture of Shia, Sunni, Christians, even secular leftists. The Houthis is an Islamic Shia group, although of a different kind than the Iranians. But they still have this axis where they see the common goal being resist Israeli expansion, oppose the Wahhabi fundamentalism and Salafi fundamentalism that's coming out of Saudi Arabia, which is a rival type of Islamism, and also oppose the influence of the West in the region, mostly the United States, to a lesser degree Britain and France. So you have this interesting alliance of states and non-state actors, and the Axis of Resistance epitomizes what generational warfare theorists call fourth generation warfare. For those who have read any of my published writings, I've written a lot about fourth generation warfare as a military model. But fourth generation warfare is when non-state actors assume the role of states in the sense in warfare and in social functions as well. And Hezbollah is probably one of the most advanced fourth generation warfare organizations in the world. It has not only its own army, but it also has its own social services and schools and media and all kinds of stuff. It's essentially a country. In fact, even though it's located within Lebanon, it's more or less eclipsed the Lebanese state as the dominant force within the Lebanese state. I mean, it also has a political arm that has seats in the Lebanese parliament, and then Lebanon has a separate military from Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is essentially more powerful than the Lebanese military. So you have a situation where a fourth generation entity has eclipsed an actual state in terms of power and influence, which is a really important factor from the insights of fourth generation warfare theory. But another aspect of fourth generation warfare theory is the moral dimension of war. And that is, this argues that it's not enough to simply have superior firepower. If that were the case, then the country with the most weapons or the most bombs or whatever would always win. But it doesn't always turn out that way. There's also this moral dimension of war where you have to have, on one hand, the will to power, the will to victory by the insurgents, by the combatants, and then you also have to win in the realm of world opinion or public opinion. And the axis of resistance understands this in a way that Israel and the Western side does not. Like the West and Israel look at it like, well, as long as we have the most weapons, we're going to win. Whereas the Iranians and their allies, they understand the moral dimension. They understand that they're more big picture oriented in the sense that they understand they have to win in the court of world opinion, and they have to be seen as the most moral actor in this particular conflict. And so far they're doing that. Like, for instance, while on one hand we see all these images coming out of Gaza of massacres of entire families that the Israelis have sponsored, on one hand we see Iran being more restrained, and it's almost like they're trying to minimize collateral damage and things like that. You see Israel setting off the beepers, the exploding beepers, and assassinating the leader of Hezbollah, the leader of Hamas. On the other hand, Israel, more or less fires a warning drone at Netanyahu rather than taking him out outright. Although Hezbollah. I actually think the axis of resistance wants Netanyahu to remain in power, because again, this feeds into the moral dimension where he has become this sort of cartoon villain. Like Todd said in the chat here, is Bibi the Jewish Hitler? Yeah, in the court of world opinion, that's the image that Netanyahu is creating for himself. He's like this sinister bad guy that's just about exterminating populations and seizing territory. And Americans have mixed opinions on that, but worldwide, that's certainly how Netanyahu was perceived. Certainly in the global South, certainly in the Islamic world, and a lot of other places as well. And so world opinion overwhelmingly has that view of Netanyahu. He's like a present-day Hitler, whereas MSNBC might say Putin is the present-day Hitler, but for the world opinion worldwide, Netanyahu is the present-day Hitler. And we see that recently with the just a couple of days ago, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and for the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, in Israel. And interestingly, Gallant and Netanyahu have had a falling out. Gallant was fired by Netanyahu as Minister of Defense. This is basically a night of the long knives purge. This is when the Hitler faction purged the Rome and Strasser faction. I think Israel, things do not look good for Israel in the long run, because Israel is in a situation where they've become a pariah state like the former apartheid regime in South Africa, only worse. Because South Africa was never actually accused of genocide. They were accused of apartheid, which they were, but they weren't actually accused of genocide. And its leaders were never indicted internationally for war crimes. And then so Israel is going the same direction as South Africa, only more rapidly. And also Israel is internally imploding. The state itself is imploding. It's on the verge of a civil war internally, aside from the war with the surrounding countries, and also it's losing in the court of world opinion within the state itself, within the Israeli state. You see that fracturing. So things don't really look very good for Israel, and I would predict that the outcome of the war is not going to be good for Israel at all, if even Israel continues to exist, within the next decade or so and doesn't fall apart completely.
Yeah, all very interesting points. Florian, thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to to add a little bit to what Keith said. Like I think it's good to mention there's lots of superficial myths among American conservatives that are gung ho for Israel, and we should mention few. Like, for example, nobody from the American right gives anything about how Israel sold drones to Azerbaijan, which they use then to ethnically cleanse Armenian Christians. Also, Israel has socialized healthcare and government-funded abortion. So, so here's a joke on you, evangelicals. So, and Netanyahu also pushed the vaccine on the population, right? So Israel was like one of the first nations to adopt the COVID vaccine countrywide. And yeah, it's true. I think Israel thinks it would be a great idea to resettle Palestinians somewhere else, which means in the West. And then the flip side is also there, that one of the reasons why Palestinians didn't get more support from conservatives in the US is also because they basically banded together with the usual leftists on American campuses. And conservatives who have been attacked by leftists on campuses will rightly point out, look, now the Palestinian guys are pro-Palestinian guys are also palling around together, so they would kill me, or they would start to harass me or try to take my free speech right away, just like the leftists. And from that, unfortunately, there's not much sympathy from the conservatives for the Palestinian cause either in the US, at least as far as I can see it. Now, coming to the Iran attacks on Israel, I'm not as optimistic to say that Iran probably just held back, because I think a country that, if Israel is really weak, then why would Iran sponsor all these terrorist groups? And then when Israel is weak, why wouldn't they pounce? Because that opportunity, why would they let that pass? So I think that the restraint from Iran could just also be a sign of Iran being weak. Maybe Iran isn't as strong, and then you can always say, but we restrained ourselves, But maybe they weren't capable of having a prolonged war against Israel. And I do see what fourth generation warfare means, but what actually has the Islamic world gained from fourth generation warfare against the US? It's like, well, I find like since 9/11, both the West and the Islamic world are worse off than they were before. Everything in life has become like a little bit more shitty for everyone. And the real winners from those attacks were actually authoritarian governments or authoritarian initiatives like the Patriot Act, which actually had a reverberating echo later on. COVID tyranny would have never been happened without the Patriot Act. I think that was like one step toward more of a surveillance state, and that is something that fourth generation warfare from Islamic nations was doing to the U.S. I'm skeptical that this will be better this time. For me, it always seemed that the reason that countries that Iran has mobilized as acts of resistance and against Israel was because the Biden administration is kind of incompetent. They didn't want to do clear actions there, and then they kind of like left their, they kind of wrung their hands and kind of let things play out, and just told the actors from time to time, don't be too mean. But there was no guidance from the US anymore. So if you think about what the Trump government did in the first period, and from 2016 to 2020, and what they may do now, I expect the second Trump government to be much more decisive on Israel. and I expect them to be very clear what they will allow and what they will not allow, and that means they will also not allow Israel to get away with everything. I think Trump is very much a pragmatic president who wants to have a solution to the conflict as quickly as possible. They will probably also expand the Abraham Accords that were launched in last 2020, which basically served to mobilize some countries into like an alliance, kind of together with Israel, but also they sidelined Palestine. So I think these Abraham Accords, they will expand them and try to get more countries on a coalition there, and then Iran would be further isolated. Because I mean, I don't think on the long run the U.S. will accept that that the Strait of Hormuz and other areas, other parts in that area, will basically be non-passageable because Iran is supporting the Houthis there. I don't think the U.S. will just like take their military force out there. No, they will try to wipe them out, fourth generation warfare or not. And I think the U.S. will be very, very decisive there. And I think there will be a very much clearer picture of what happens in the Middle East over the next 1 to 2 years. Now it's just like some kind of like, it's either moving forward or backward. And you can say, yeah, maybe it does move forward. Maybe there's fourth generation warfare by Iran and its allies, and the Logos brought BRICS nations up and everything. Maybe there's a larger correlation internationally that I'm just not seeing. But to me, it's more likely that what happens in the Middle East is the result from a power vacuum where people that are in that, or the actors in that vacuum, are kind of doing what they like to do, but not completely. And so it's a confusing situation. And I think that's because the US hasn't shown any leadership in that region. I think that is what Trump will bring up much more decisively in the future. And I think that's where we are going to be headed in the Middle East. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot here. I guess I'll start with some of your insights here, Florian. Well, okay, so when I say that Iran is using restraint, I'm not implying that Israel's weak. What I'm saying is that Iran, by its own strategy, possibly in a broader strategic unity with China, is playing this diplomatic game where it has to use restraint to convince the rest of the world that it's the good guy and Israel's the bad guy in order to get Israel more isolated. Because this is a long game, right? This is a protracted war strategy going back to Mao, going back to Lawrence of Arabia. And so the idea is you need to isolate them economically, which is in part done by isolating them politically, as Britain did to Germany in World War I. And so by positioning yourself as the good guy to the world opinion, and of course, Israel is strong. I mean, I think the axis of resistance knows that, which is why they are carefully escalating, and they're also usually letting Israel move first in order to make them look bad. To your point, Keith, yeah, Palestine in its current any sort of like ex-enclave in Palestine is indefensible unless you have more territory in the Middle East. We saw this in the Middle Ages with the Crusades. The Crusader states were, in the long run, indefensible because they were surrounded by Islamic forces. From the point of view of the Romans, of course, they controlled Syria, Asia Minor, and Egypt. So Palestine was much more defensible from their point of view. Israel, if it keeps to its current borders, cannot maintain itself defensively for very long. There's no ability for defense in depth. And if the U.S. does support Israel as strongly as it probably will, Trump is likely to support Israel pretty strongly. He has appointed a lot of anti-Iran hawks to his cabinet. That is going to make the UN look like a sort of because the U.S. if the global opinion and other international bodies and the UN turn against Israel and the U.S. just says no, veto, and give a blank check to Bibi, then that's going to make the UN look like a front. It's a front for the U.S. and its allies to violate international law. And I know, Logos, you and I have talked about this before. China's long game is probably to make the U.S. do something really stupid that makes the whole world see the UN as just a toy that the US uses for its own interests, ignoring international law as it sees fit. And in fact, that's exactly Russia's justification for the invasion of Ukraine. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 violated the Security Council. And before that, when there was NATO troops deployed to Kosovo, that also was against international law. They couldn't get the NATO charter support for it. They did anyhow. So Russia's like, yeah, the US doesn't care about international law. We don't either. Why should we? And as that becomes more and more apparent to the rest of the world, that will not only isolate Israel, but it will isolate the United States, which plays into the hands of all of these different players here. And I guess back to you, Keith. The 9/11 for Israel was 11/7, and 11/7. Whether you want to say it was an inside job like Alex Jones, whether you want to say it was a blowback like Ron Paul, whatever. We do know that there was a Hamas Bibi connection back in the day. So we could argue at least was the most conservative claim would be this. It's sort of like in a CIA spook film where like some small group that was funded just kind of runs away from its handlers. You could say Hamas maybe did that, right? Kind of ran away from its handlers and kind of did all the stuff that Israel didn't expect. Also, to your point, South Africa was not expansionist. It was an insular country. South Africa was like Sparta. It was a small population of enfranchised citizens ruling over a large body of non-enfranchised people. And so that makes expansion very dangerous because the troops that you have need to be used for security purposes, not expansion. Israel, so far, is more consolidated and ethnically homogeneous, which makes it more willing to expand because it can trust its armed forces to not revolt. Oh, hold on a second here. Got a call coming in. So yeah, that's my thoughts. You, Logos.
There's a lot here. I think I'll pass and come back when I have something to say.
All right, Keith, you.
Well, as far as the issue of the motivations of Iran, one thing we have to consider is that the Axis of Resistance forces are very big picture oriented. They see themselves as representatives of an ancient civilization, ancient culture, ancient religion, and they look at it like theologically they're going to win in the long run. They've just got to tough it out until the meantime. And for that reason, they're willing to assume losses that more westernized people typically aren't. Like one of the long-term effects of the Vietnam War is that it made Americans unwilling to accept imperialist war if there's any cost on their side. Like military conscription, like high casualties, even of professional soldiers, like special war taxes, things like rationing of goods. I mean, that's why every U.S. war since Vietnam has either been fought with professional military, mercenaries, foreign troops, proxy armies, and paid for typically with debt rather than with extra taxes or anything, or cuts to social programs or any of that kind of stuff. But in the Islamic world, they think of themselves as, representing this religion they believe to be true, as well as an ancient culture and civilization with history and destiny and God and religion all being on their side. So they're willing to absorb more losses in the long run. They're not as concerned about the economic cost. They're not as necessarily as concerned about the casualties. I mean, they're concerned about casualties, but they're willing to take more casualties if that's what it means to achieve victory. It's very similar to the situation the United States faced when fighting the Viet Cong or fighting the Chinese and Korean insurgents, in those wars, in East Asia, the mid to late 20th century. Only perhaps even more intense than that. So that, I think, is the long-term end game that the Axis of Resistance has. Their goal is to rid their region that they consider to be the rightful territory of, Islamic people or certainly Middle Eastern people. They want to rid those territories of what they consider to be these intruders, interlopers, imperialists, invaders, whatever, whether it's the Americans, the Europeans, the Israelis, or whomever. So that's their motivation. As for Russia and China, those two countries have a greater interest in stability in the Middle East than we do in the West, because they're in closer proximity to it. That's why Russia was backing Syria in the Syrian civil war. That's why China has tried to negotiate a rapprochement between the Gulf states and Iran, because it's in their interest that there be stability. Not because, for one thing, they want to engage in trade and economic development in the region. They have economic interests, but also they don't want to have Islamic terrorist insurgencies going on in their own backyard, or what's their backyard compared to the West. Keep in mind, Russia has problems with that as well, with Islamic terrorism. You have Islamic separatist tendencies even within Russia itself, like in the Chechnya region. You have issues with that in China, in the Xinjiang province, with groups like the Uyghurs. So they don't want anything that's going to fuel Islamic terrorism. Whereas the Americans and the Europeans are more willing to accept some of that, because it's not in as close a proximity. So the Russians and the Chinese back the axis of resistance, at least indirectly, for that reason, or at least they try to be more neutral in terms of their handling of the conflicts between the axis of resistance and Israel and the Gulf states. Now, as far as what the Trump administration's policies are likely to be, I would say that what has been elected in recent weeks, it amounts to an Israel first regime in the United States. Because if you look at who Trump's biggest backers are financially, the number one is Miriam Adelson, who's the ex-wife of the late Sheldon Adelson. He was a casino magnate. She gave $100 million to Trump's campaign. Now, she didn't give Trump $100 million because she likes his hair. She's expecting a return on that investment. And if you look at the people that Trump has appointed to key positions so far, there's a lot of diversity among them in terms of their backgrounds and that kind of thing. But one thing they all have in common is that they're all pro Israel. They're all Israel hardliners, or at least they come from that kind of background. For example, Tulsi Gabbard is often thought of as an anti-war person, but she's actually pro-Israel and a hardliner on the terror war against these Islamic terrorist groups. She's just against the regime change wars like Iraq. And my interpretation of her is that she's an India firster. She's a Hare Krishna. Well, she belongs to a sect that's an offshoot of the Hare Krishnas, and she's a Hindu, and she's also an India firster by extension. So she sees Islamic insurgencies as counter to the interest of Hinduism. So that's her motivation. You also have Robert F. Kennedy, who's a close friend, ally of Rabbi Shmuley, who's a hardline Zionist. There's this lengthy history, by the way, in the United States of Jewish Zionists using Irish Catholics as frontmen, like that. And then if you look at other people in Trump's administration, you see that Elon Musk, he's going to hold some special appointed position. He also, after he was called out for allegedly being anti-Semitic, he went to Israel and kissed Bibi's ring and all of that. And then you have Mike Huckabee, or Hucksterby, as I call him, who's he's going to be the ambassador to Israel. He's like this hardline Christian Zionist evangelical, like John Hagee or somebody like that. Then you also have Pete Hegseth being appointed to the Department of Defense. Now, that appointment may not be confirmed, because that guy has some accusations, some Me Too type accusations in his background. But he's also some kind of evangelical Christian Zionist, or maybe he's a Catholic Zionist or something like that. And then you have Marco Rubio being appointed to Secretary of State. In the 2016 election, in the primaries, Republican primaries, when you had all these different Republican candidates competing against Trump, Bill Kristol's favorite candidate was actually Marco Rubio. So Marco Rubio comes from this kind of neoconish, arch neoconish background. And of course, pro-Israel is like Article 1 of neoconservatism or neoconism. So these are the kinds of folks that are getting appointed to Trump's cabinet, and whatever their differences, the one thing they have in common is being pro-Israel. And when I look at the content of the Republican Party today, I think that's really the one litmus test for being a Republican. If you have to be pro-Israel, you could be anything else. You can be an openly gay, atheist, transgender, something like, say, Bruce Jenner or Caitlyn Jenner or somebody like that and be a Republican. Or, you could probably even be a communist and be a Republican, as long as you're pro-Israel. So I think what we have today is a Israel first regime that's been elected in the United States, bought and paid for with domestic American Zionist money. And American foreign policy in Israel, in the Middle East, is going to be reflective of that. Now, the one obstacle there is Trump's own ego, because he's not going to want to do anything that undermines his own position. He doesn't personally like Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu wouldn't back him over the Stop the Steal thing back in 2020. So he has a grudge against Netanyahu for that. So I think that Trump is going to be an Israel first president, except for when Israel first conflicts with Trump first. So the question is going to be, when you get two guys like Trump and Netanyahu with these massive egos together, what kind of clashes are going to be? And then as far as the actual war and the unfolding of the war, what kind of political liability is that going to become for Trump himself or for his successors or his movement or whatever? And all that's up in the air. I don't really know what's going to happen there.
All right, Logos, do you feel like you have anything you want to add, or should we just go to Florian?
Let's go to Florian. All
right, Florian.
Let's go. Okay. I think from what Keith said, I could also imagine that that the military aid to Ukraine is going to be wound down, and the U.S. will push for a quick solution to the Ukraine-Russia crisis, a war, however you want to call it, to free up resources to put more pressure into the Middle East, right? Which would speak to what I think Todd earlier said, that the U.S. maybe doesn't have the resources anymore to have like multiple wars at multiple fronts, right? So maybe it's not only that we want to be strong for Israel, but also we can't be in two scenarios at the same time, which is also pretty damning. And besides, I just one thought comes to my mind: it would be awesome for my German friends to see an American aircraft carrier off the Baltic, off the coast of Germany on the Baltic Sea. But besides that, I think I found it interesting when Keith said Iran doesn't basically fear short-term costs because they have a long-term religious view, and it reminded me a little bit of China, right? China also plays the long game, or is said to play the long game economically. I would like to know how does Iran plan on being powerful enough to project beyond Hezbollah, Houthi, and Hamas, right? So does Iran imagine like a similar bricks and road initiative or belt and road initiative that China does, or how do they want to project their power outward? How is it actually looking internally in Iran? Because if you have a country that's led by mullahs for decades, wouldn't that drive out all the competent people? Those would be my questions.
Well, so one thing, Florian, there has been talk that Russia, Iran, and India will all build an overland rail system. So from Russia through the Caucasus, Russia through the Caspian Sea, into Iran, into India, which prevents naval interdiction by the U.S. since it's all overland. So to answer that question, I think that's how Iran hopes to grow economically in the future, probably also piggybacking off the Belt and Road Initiative. I think also, too, Iran and Turkey will be, if we view this current struggle between Iran and Israel, I think, I agree with Keith. Things are looking pretty bad for Israel, both internally due to and in fact, maybe Bibi wanted this to happen to help solidify his control at home, given how fractured Israel was. Regardless, the international pressure, both from the non-involved states through diplomatic and economic pressure, plus then the military pressure of Iran and its axis of resistance, might very well crush Israel. And if we envision a future where Iran is no longer fighting Israel because it's not an issue for whatever reason, what they're really doing, I think, is positioning themselves to challenge Turkey, because Turkey also wants to be the Islamic leader. Erdogan wants to be the new Ottoman Empire, right? So at one point, I think Tulsi Gabbard on Twitter said that Erdogan was an Islamist who wanted to revive the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of this is symbolic, because a caliph is not, he's a political leader as well as a religious leader, but he's more of a religious leader. So you could have a caliph even with very little military power, but still has a lot of spiritual power. So like the Abbasid Caliphate in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. So Iran could be positioning itself as a religious leader that other Muslims would look to. How do you get them to look to you? You defend Palestine. You defend the one group of people that other Muslims say they care about, but don't. And that's how you get to build that capital up as the sword of Islam, the defender of the faithful. Even though you're Shiite, and even though Palestinians are mostly Sunni, that's how you build that capital up. So I think that's what Iran's doing. We're nearing the end of the hour, so I think we'll try to just sum this up. We'll give everybody like a one-sentence statement, unless, Logos, you have something you want to say right now.
No, I'm good.
All right, let's try to keep it short for a one-sentence statement. I'll just say that, like I said, 11/7 was Israel's 9/11. They wanted this to happen for a long time, and it happened. But just like our war on terror, I don't think it'll end too well for them. Sum up in one sentence, Logos.
Once Trump comes in, Ukraine's out, Israel's in. It's going to be a wild, bumpy ride for the Middle East and China. Can't wait to see what BRICS do.
Keith, one sentence summary.
The danger of the current situation in the Middle East for the United States is that Israel is trying to lure the United States into a shooting war with the Axis of Resistance forces in order to use American military power to eliminate Israel's regional rivals so that Israel can continue this expansionist program that I discussed earlier. So that's what Americans that want to keep their own country out of another Middle Eastern war need to be focused on.
All right, Florian, one sentence summary.
I think Israel will have major problems in the future when the UK and France are government majority Muslim. They will lose international support, and then one could foresee a future for Europe where anti-Islamic parties like Geert Wilders' party, maybe even the AFD, certainly the Front National in France, are pushed by the powers that be as an antipole to Muslim domination in Europe, which could be dangerous for Israel.
All right. Thanks again, Logos, Keith, Florian. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.